Hello everybody and welcome back. It is great to talk to all of you again. And today this whole video is basically going to be addressing this issue. What is wrong with the Atlanta and the Sims? And the reason this video is going to be dedicated to this issue is because of a forum post on the North American World of Warships server by LittleWhiteMouse. Now, LittleWhiteMouse is a community contributor, and she does some pretty awesome work posting up reviews and stuff on the forums. And her work that I've seen has been very, very well researched, very, very detailed. And so when she posted this thread talking about the biggest nerf that wasn't ever a nerf, it caught my attention, and I have been sort of reading this thread and really trying to think back to, things as they were before. And what LittleWhiteMouse basically states in her post is that the 127mm guns for the US ships like the Atlanta and the destroyers like the Sims, the shelf life times have never changed, which means that the arcs on the guns have not changed either. Now, seeing these numbers, my initial reaction was, oh boy, did I miss something? And, have I been wrong all this time? And by the way, if I'm wrong, I will be the very first person to admit that I messed something up horribly. And in this particular case, I looked at the numbers and I'm like, I'm gonna have to go back and look at some of these older videos and, see what it looked like. And I have to agree with her. The arcs haven't changed. I played the Atlanta recently. This was one of the battles, and I looked back to one of my earlier videos where I had the Atlanta, and, lo and behold, the shell arcs are the same. And so immediately once I realized that, I'm like, oh boy, I've sort of screwed something up really badly here by thinking that the arcs have changed. And I had to go back and really think about it. Like, what happened to make me think this? And my biggest memory about the first sort of like that patch where things start to go really wrong was we went from version 3.0 to version 3.1. And immediately what happened after 3.1 came out was the sudden feeling that I couldn't hit anything at all. Like, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't hit a ship at distance. And that initial sort of confusion, like, what is going on? I think as I'm, shooting sort of in the same way, I'm looking at it like something that's, 10 kilometers away, and I'm going, why can't I hit this target? And I think I found what I would guess is the most reasonable thing to suspect, which is, okay, the shelf flight times must have been royally screwed up. Like, something has gone wrong there. And I think I wasn't the only person who thought this. I think, quite a few other people looked at it post 3.1 and said the same thing. And now it's become the sort of perpetual storyline about the Sims and the Atlanta, is that they have these horrible arcs that are just so much worse than they used to be. And they're not. They're actually the same arcs. So what's changed? Well, I had to go back and look at the patch notes, and in sort of a little bit of a mention in the 3.1 patch notes is a mention that there was an adjustment to the the way the ships turned, and that pretty much was it. There were no real specific numbers about how much things had changed, just the mention that something had changed. And so if you were reading the patch notes, you sort of thought, okay, maybe small adjustments were made here and there. And of course you went into the game and all of a sudden you couldn't hit anything at all. And so the reaction must have been, well, if I can't hit anything at all, then something must have gone wrong. Like, the arcs on the ship must have gone wrong, or they've done something to the guns. And the truth of the matter is that the Atlanta, as the way she is right now, was designed for, fighting ships prior to that particular change. And here's how big the changes were. So, for example, the Yaoba, which prior to 3.1 had an 870-meter turn radius, and that was the same for the Miyoko and the same for the Mogami. And after the 3.1 patch, they dropped down to 710 meters, 780, and 750-meter turn radiuses. So that's a pretty substantial reduction in the turn radiuses. And if you thought the Japanese cruisers, were notable, think about the US cruisers that the Atlanta had to fight. So for example, the Cleveland went from 830 to 660. Pensacola went from 800 to 620. The New Orleans went from 820 to 660. And all those changes are still in the game today. I mean, heck, even the battleships had a massive reduction in their turning radiuses. The Fuso went from 910 meters in 0.3.0 to 660 in patch 0.3.1. Now, recently, and now this is really interesting, recently when I've taken the Atlanta out, I've been like, oh, she's not as bad as I remember her. And that's also because not too long ago there was that battleship turn radius nerf, where a lot of the battleships like the Fuso, the Nagato, the Amagi, they had their turn radiuses bumped up. So the Fuso went from 660 in patch 0.3.1 to 740. So all of a sudden the battleships became a little bit easier to hit. However, back when patch 0.3.1 happened, where all the ships had these huge reductions to their turn radiuses, what immediately happened is that the minute that they came under fire from a U.S. destroyer like the Sims or the Atlanta, where the shells would take, close to 10 seconds, maybe even more on the U.S. destroyers to get to target, the ships could just say, oh, okay, well, let me just press A or press D and let me just, turn my ship. And immediately they made it, impossible for you to hit shells at longer range. So what ended up happening, realistically speaking, is that there was this 20%, almost even in some cases 20 something percent buff to the turn radiuses of pretty much every ship in the game. I mean, hell, the Atlanta went from 830 to 610 meter turn radiuses. But what didn't happen was that the arcs and the guns weren't really given a buff in return. And so, of course, that brings us to the question of what can we do today? What can we do to make the Atlanta and the Sims better? Because these two ships, let's be honest, today are still pretty dismal ships. I mean, the Atlanta already had many, many weaknesses, very weak turrets, really pathetic range. And really the only thing she had going for her was, that rate of fire and just the sheer number of shells that she can output. Now, of course, those advantages only really present themselves if you're actually able to hit targets. And with the Atlanta, hitting targets is not all that easy, and it's even worse if you happen to be on the Sims. So what can be done to make the Atlanta a little bit better for the game that we have right now? Well, I think one is that both the Atlanta and the Sims, and I can talk about both ships at the same time, but the Atlanta first. But with the Atlanta, I think improvement on the shell arcs, not a huge improvement, because yes, there's still US guns, and you don't want to have them be like lasers and everything, and I understand that. And it is still a 38 caliber gun, rather short barrel, so the muzzle velocity aren't great, so the high arcs, I get that. But a slight improvement on the arc. I mean, the ship's got an over 20% ish buff to the turn radiuses, maybe a 10% reduction in the arcs of the Atlanta, or roughly around 10% for the Atlanta the Sims. Something just to get the arcs down a little bit, so that these ships actually have a chance that when they use their guns, that they're actually going to be able to hit something. So that, I think, is the first change on the Atlanta. Second, the Atlanta's short range of 11.1 kilometers, I think at release, I think that might have been okay. But we are talking about the game now, today, with all these additional ships and with the Russian cruisers coming, where 11.1 kilometers on a cruiser really, I don't think is going to cut it anymore. And I think there's an issue of power creep there as well. So I think in this particular case for the Atlanta, an increase to maybe 12 kilometers, maybe 12.5 kilometers, somewhere closer to what the gearing would get with a range mod on its guns. Maybe that could be the Atlanta stock, base range. And if it gets advanced firing training, it gets a little bit of a boost there to maybe something close to like 14.5 kilometers. And I think in a game right now, that I think would make the Atlanta pretty reasonable in terms of, capabilities, considering, again, her arcs are still not going to be that great at that kind of range, and you're really only going to be using that range on things like a battleship, which, at least is going to give you that chance to kind of fight, because really the Atlanta stands... In the game right now, she stands very little chance, I think, against a lot of battleships and a lot of the cruisers, especially the heavy cruisers like the Miyoko and, the Mogami. It's going to struggle against those ships, and I really think that something should be done to make her a little bit more viable. And that's pretty much it. We're not saying here's some massive changes to the ship. We're talking about, still small changes, but enough to make it so that the Atlanta isn't absolutely horrid as a ship. And that's it. Moving on to the Sims. If you look at the Sims and you look at the gun arcs and you look at all the US destroyers and their gun arcs, I think it is reasonable to say that a slightly better shell arc is in order. Just a better arc, something a little bit flatter. Again, I'm not calling for Russian levels of arcs. I'm just saying something that is actually going to allow you to hit things at a little bit higher range. Because truth be told, you could hit ships pretty effectively with a Russian destroyer out to 12, 13 kilometers. And you can hit them pretty reliably. With a US destroyer, like, totally forget that. That's just not happening at all. So, a little bit better arcs, at range. And also, remember, you also have to factor in that radar is also coming as well for the higher tier US destroyers. And, initially, the safety for the US destroyers was to get a little bit closer to mitigate that arc. But if you bring in radar and they can't even be close anymore, I really think that an improvement to their arcs is going to be necessary. Now, specifically for the Sims, if you make the arcs a little bit better, so they're a little bit more flat and they're a little bit more usable, I think the only other change I would recommend making is an improvement on her torpedoes. The Sims, for reasons I cannot understand, got longer range torpedoes. They go 9.2 kilometers, but they go at a pitiful 49 knots, and even when they get there, they do a dismal amount of damage, only 8,900. I think if it was brought more in line to what the Mahan has for torpedo damage, which is around 11,000 and the torps go 55 knots, I think if you get that kind of torpedo on the Sims, I think the Sims would actually be a pretty good tier 7 destroyer. Anyways, folks, that pretty much does it for this video. I mean, I've hopefully been able to explain why the 127mm guns haven't been nerfed, and also why the Atlanta and the Sims are all of a sudden these horrible ships that none of us really want to play. Anyways, if you have any opinions on this and changes that you think might work, and questions and comments as usual, do leave those in the comment section below. One last thing, if you happen to be on the North American World of Warships forums, definitely go check out LittleWhiteMouse. She's got some fantastic guides and reviews and stuff on the game, and her work is excellent, and you should definitely go take a look. Anyways, folks, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and until next time, take care.